It was Tuesday, April 17th, 1984, at the Brendan Byrne Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Van Halen was in the middle of their 1984 world tour, performing to a sold-out crowd of 18,000 screaming fans. Eddie Van Halen was on fire that night, his Frankenstrat guitar cutting through the arena like a sonic razor blade. The band had already torn through Unchained and Running with the Devil, and now they were deep into Eruption, Eddie's legendary instrumental showcase that had redefined what a guitar could do. But then something happened that nobody could have anticipated. Eddie suddenly stopped playing mid-solo. His fingers froze on the fretboard. The drum fill that Alex Van Halen had prepared never came. Michael Anthony's bass line faded into confused silence. David Lee Roth, backstage preparing for his entrance, heard the sudden quiet and rushed to the wings. 28,000 eyes focused on Eddie Van Halen as he stood motionless under the white-hot stage lights, staring into the crowd with an expression that his brother would later describe as looking like he'd seen a ghost. Eddie's guitar tech had never seen him stop a performance like this. Not for broken strings, not for equipment failure, not for anything. Eddie slowly walked to the front edge of the stage, shielding his eyes from the spotlights, scanning section 114. His hands were shaking visibly. Security Chief Marcus Webb moved toward the stage, hand on his radio, thinking there was a threat. But Eddie wasn't looking scared. He was looking transfixed. "Stop everything," Eddie said into his microphone, his Dutch accent thicker than usual. "Turn up the house lights. I need to see someone." The audience erupted in confused murmurs. The house lights came up, flooding the arena. Eddie was still staring at section 114, row 23. His hand slowly rose, pointing directly at someone. "You," Eddie said, his voice cracking. "The man in row 23 with the blue case. Sir, I need you to come. Backstage right now. Please." But before we continue with what happened next, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. You're about to hear a story that reveals a side of Eddie Van Halen that even his closest friends didn't know existed. This isn't just about a guitar god stopping his concert. This is about family, sacrifice, and the immigrant experience that shaped the greatest guitarist of his generation. The man Eddie was pointing at was in his late 60s, wearing a worn brown cardigan and holding what appeared to be an old leather instrument case. The case was blue, faded by decades, with brass latches turned green with age. The man looked around in confusion, pointing at his own chest. "Yes, sir," Eddie said, tears visible on his face. "You with the blue case. Please, I need to talk to you. Right now." Security converged on the section as the man stood up slowly, clearly bewildered. He was tall but stooped, with white hair and weathered hands. The woman next to him, his daughter, grabbed his arm. "Papa, what's going on?" she whispered in Dutch. "Ik weet het niet," the old man replied. "I don't know." As security began escorting the man backstage, Eddie turned to the audience, wiping his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eddie said, voice thick with emotion. "I apologize for stopping the show, but something just happened that is more important than any song I could play tonight. This will only take a few minutes, but I promise you, what you're about to witness is real, and it's been 22 years in the making." Then Eddie Van Halen walked off stage, leaving his band, crew, and 18,000 fans in stunned silence. Backstage, Eddie was pacing in the corridor, his Frankenstrat still strapped across his chest, looking almost violent under the fluorescent lights. When the old man was brought through security, Eddie stopped pacing immediately. The moment their eyes met, Both men froze. The old man's face went white. The blue case slipped from his fingers and hit the concrete floor with a hollow thud. Eddie took 3 steps forward, then stopped, his whole body trembling. "Meneer Jansen," Eddie whispered. "Is it really you?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. "Edward," he said, using Eddie's birth name. "Dear God, Edward Van Halen. I would recognize your face anywhere." Eddie crossed the distance and embraced the old man, both crying openly. Security personnel had no idea what they were witnessing. "How did you recognize me in that crowd?" the old man asked. "How could you possibly see me from the stage?" Eddie pulled back, pointing at the blue case on the floor. "That case. That was my father's case. I would recognize it anywhere. It's been missing for 22 years. The story of how that case went missing goes back to 1962, when the Van Halen family left the Netherlands for America. But what happened before that departure was something Eddie had never spoken about publicly, something that haunted him through every performance. And this random concert in New Jersey was about to bring it all flooding back. The old man bent down and picked up the blue case, handing it to Eddie with both hands. Eddie took it, ran his fingers over the brass latches, over the worn leather, over the faded name tag that still read, Jan Van Halen, Nijmegen. "I've been looking for this for more than 20 years, Eddie said quietly. Meneer Jansen wiped his eyes. "Your father asked me to hold on to it before you left for America. He said he would send for it once settled, but I never heard from him again. I tried to find your family, Edward. I tried for years." Eddie opened the latches. Inside was a clarinet, old and tarnished, but intact. Eddie lifted it out with shaking hands. "This was the first instrument my father ever owned," Eddie explained to the gathered crew. "Before he played saxophone, before piano, before any of that, he played clarinet in a Dutch military band. This clarinet is what started everything." Alex Van Halen appeared in the corridor. When he saw Eddie holding their father's clarinet, his expression changed from confusion to recognition to something deeper. "Is that?" Alex started. Eddie nodded. "It's Papa's clarinet. The one he had to leave behind when we came to America. Jan Van Halen had been a professional musician in the Netherlands, performing with various jazz bands. But in 1962, facing economic uncertainty, he made the difficult decision to move his family to America. The move required money they didn't have. Jan sold almost everything to afford 4 one-way tickets to New York. He sold his saxophone, his piano, his record collection. But there was one thing he couldn't bring himself to sell: his father's clarinet, passed down through 2 generations of Van Halen musicians. "My father couldn't afford to take the clarinet with us," Eddie said. "We were only allowed 2 suitcases per person. Papa tried to make it fit, but there wasn't room. So he went to Meneer Jansen and asked him to keep it safe." Meneer Jansen nodded. "Jan came to my apartment the night before you left. He was crying. He handed me this case and said, 'This belonged to my father and his father before him. Please keep it safe. When I'm settled in America, I'll send for it.' But he never did," Eddie said quietly. "Because we never had money. Not for years. We lived in poverty in Pasadena. My father worked as a janitor, as a dishwasher. My mother worked as a maid. Alex and I were bullied for being immigrants. Papa didn't have money to send for a clarinet when he couldn't even feed us properly sometimes." What happened to the Van Halen family in those early years was a story of immigrant struggle that millions could relate to. But for Jan Van Halen, it came with an additional burden. He had been a respected musician in the Netherlands. In America, He was nobody, just another immigrant working menial jobs to survive. And the clarinet became a symbol of everything he'd lost. Eddie's voice grew quieter. My father never talked about the clarinet, not once. But I knew he thought about it. Sometimes I would catch him looking at Alex and me when we practiced piano, and there would be this expression on his face, like he was mourning something. Years later, after Van Halen became successful, I asked him about it. I told him I wanted to find it, to bring it to America. What did he say? Meneer Jansen asked. Eddie smiled sadly. He said it didn't matter anymore. He said that clarinet was from a different life. He said his musical legacy wasn't in an old instrument. It was in his sons, in the music Alex and I created. The corridor was silent except for the muffled sound of the restless crowd beyond. Alex Van Halen was crying now. But I never stopped looking, Eddie continued. Not because Papa wanted it back, but because I needed it. I needed to understand where we came from, what we'd sacrificed. I hired investigators, but the records from 1962, Nijmegen, were incomplete. It was impossible. Meneer Jansen reached into his jacket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Your father wrote me one letter. It arrived 3 months after you left. Eddie opened it carefully. Inside was a single page in his father's handwriting, dated August 1962. Dear friend, the letter began, we have arrived in America, but it is not what I imagined. The streets are not paved with gold. Work is scarce. We live in a small apartment, and my sons cry at night because the other children mock their accent. I work 12 hours washing dishes, and my hands bleed from chemicals. At night, I dream of the clarinet, of playing music with you in Nijmegen, of a life that seems far away. But I must believe this sacrifice will be worth it. Please keep the clarinet safe. When things improve, I will send for it. Your friend, John. Eddie finished reading and sat down. He never sent for it because things never improved. Not for him. By the time Van Halen became successful, Papa was already sick. Lung cancer. He died in 1986, 2 years after this tour. He never got to see us at our peak. This was why Eddie Van Halen had stopped the concert. This wasn't about a lost instrument. This was about immigrant trauma, about generational sacrifice, about a father who gave up everything so his sons could become the musicians he never got to be. Meneer Jansen explained how he ended up at the concert. I moved to America 5 years ago. My daughter married an American and settled in New Jersey. I brought the clarinet because I never gave up hope. When I saw Van Halen was playing here, I had to attend. I had to see if it was really you, the same boys I used to see at Jan's apartment. You brought the clarinet to the concert? Eddie asked. I bring it everywhere, Meneer Jansen said simply. It's been with me for 22 years. When you looked at me from the stage, when you recognized the case, I knew this was meant to happen. Eddie hugged him again. You kept your promise. For 22 years, you kept my father's clarinet safe. What happened next became legendary in Van Halen concert history. Eddie carried the blue case back onto stage, with Meneer Jansen following, supported by Eddie's arm. The crowd erupted when they saw Eddie return with an elderly man. Eddie walked to the microphone, still holding the case. The arena fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, Eddie began, I want to introduce you to Meneer Jansen. This man is the reason I'm standing here tonight. This man is the reason Van Halen exists. For the next 10 minutes, Eddie told the entire story. He told them about his father, the clarinet, leaving the Netherlands with nothing, the poverty in Pasadena, learning music in a garage while his parents worked multiple jobs. He told them about Meneer Jansen keeping the clarinet safe for 22 years, carrying it to America, bringing it to this concert. By the time Eddie finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the arena. 18,000 people stood and applauded Meneer Jansen for 5 solid minutes. Many were immigrants themselves or children of immigrants. But Eddie Van Halen wasn't finished. What he did next changed not just the concert, but how he thought about his father's legacy and his responsibility as a successful immigrant who'd achieved the American dream. Eddie opened the blue case on stage and lifted out the clarinet. It gleamed under the stage lights. "This clarinet represents everything my father gave up, so my brother and I could chase our dreams," Eddie said. He was a musician in the Netherlands who played for audiences. In America, he was just another immigrant working shit jobs. But he never complained. He never told us we were wasting our time with music. Eddie turned to Alex. "Come here." Alex walked to the front of the stage. Eddie handed him the clarinet and Alex held it like glass. "Our father couldn't be here tonight," Eddie said to the audience. "He's sick. Very sick. But I want to dedicate the rest of this concert to Jan Van Halen and to every parent who sacrificed everything so their children could have a chance." Van Halen then performed a 20-minute version of Jamie's Cryin' that transitioned into an extended section where Eddie incorporated melodic elements that mimicked clarinet phrasing, a tribute to his father's instrument. The performance was electric, emotional, raw. After the concert, Eddie established the Van Halen Family Foundation, dedicated to helping immigrant families, with special focus on preserving the cultural and artistic heritage immigrants often had to abandon. Meneer Jansen became the foundation's first advisor. The blue clarinet was professionally restored and displayed at the foundation headquarters in Los Angeles, next to a photograph of Jan Van Halen as a young man in the Netherlands, holding the clarinet in his military band uniform. Meneer Jansen lived until 1998. He never missed a Van Halen concert on the East Coast, always sitting close to the stage. Eddie visited him regularly, often bringing his son Wolfgang to meet the man who'd kept his grandfather's treasure safe. Jan Van Halen died in December 1986, less than 3 years after that New Jersey concert. Eddie was with him at the end, holding his hand. In his final moments, Jan asked for the clarinet. Eddie had brought it. Jan held the instrument one last time, ran his fingers over the keys, and smiled. "I made the right choice," Jan whispered in Dutch. "Everything I gave up, it was worth it. You boys became everything I hoped for." Those were his last words. Eddie kept the clarinet at his bedside for the rest of his life. The story of Eddie Van Halen, Meneer Jansen, and the blue clarinet reminds us that behind every success is sacrifice we rarely see, that immigrants carry invisible burdens of everything they left behind, that friendship and promises can endure decades of separation, and that sometimes we're given the chance to honor the people who made our dreams possible. Eddie stopped his concert because he recognized an object his father had been forced to abandon. But really, he stopped because he recognized an opportunity to acknowledge the immigrant experience, to honor his father's sacrifice publicly, and to remind everyone that fame means nothing if you forget who paid the price for your journey. The restored clarinet still sits in the Van Halen Family Foundation headquarters, a permanent reminder that what we leave behind doesn't disappear. Sometimes it finds its way back to us. And every year on John Van Halen's birthday, Eddie would take the clarinet out and attempt to play a simple melody his father used to play in their Pasadena garage. Eddie never got good at clarinet, but that wasn't the point. The point was remembering, honoring, and keeping alive the musical lineage that started with a Dutch military band clarinetist and ended with one of the greatest guitarists the world has ever known. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and share this video. Let us know in the comments if you have a story of immigrant sacrifice, of promises kept across decades. And remember, sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop everything to acknowledge the people who made our triumph possible.